Okay, welcome back. Last time we ended off talking about different kinds of attractor states and the nature of those sorts of spaces within a system and how some systems can have more than one attractor. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the idea of fitness and how fitness ties in with this idea of attractor states, in that some attractor states are more fit than others, and then we can think a little bit more about what we mean by fitness. Okay. So here we have an illustration of a ball that's sitting on a plane, and we can think of this plane as being a kind of attractor state. So the ball that's sitting over here, once it's in this space, and it's set down at this position, it doesn't have a trajectory where it wants to go anywhere else. It's going to remain here and remain stable in this position. So we can think of that as a kind of attractor state. What's interesting is if we nudge this ball over a little bit to the right, it's also going to stay in this position. There's nothing inherently better about this state versus any other state along the plane, because if we start off a ball at any of these positions, it's going to stay there. Conversely, if we move to this scenario, and again, we can think about the funnel that we saw, or the pendulum, the funnel from the science fair, where no matter where you start a marble in the system state, it's eventually going to go down into that funnel. So think about this not exactly as being like a funnel, but here we have the idea that if you were to start a ball over here, it will come down and end up in this basin of attraction. Similarly, we started over here, it's going to come into this basin of attraction. If we start it right at the edge, then it becomes very, very sensitive. It might shift over to the right, or it might shift over to the left. So it has two different kinds of attractor states in this moment over here, and it's quite a sensitive state. We can also think about this as being a tipping point. But here we have a system with two different attractor states, and we can see that these attractors are more stable than this particular attractor. This one a little less stable than this one over here, because imagine that we were to shock the system, set a bit of vibration in it, shake it up a little bit. It could be that if we shook this system, that then it would tend to fall over into this other deeper basin of attraction. And then we can look at these two basins as well here. Regardless of where we set a ball in the system, it's not going to stick to here. It's going to want to flow downwards. Similarly, any place that we put it in this end of the system, it's going to slide down into this location. This is also an attractor, because if we place the ball perfectly there, it will stay in place, but it's a very, very small attractor space. It doesn't sort of have a lot of holding energy. The slightest shake, and we call that shake in complexity, the slightest perturbation, it's going to move away from that regime. Okay, so keep that in mind, and we're going to go to the next slide. Now, I showed you this idea of attractors in kind of a relatively smooth two-dimensional space. I could have just shown these as lines as opposed to as planes, but the planes are extruded. They don't do anything in 3 dimensions. That's particularly interesting. But let's imagine now that we think about a space that has multiple attractors, and we depict these attractors as a kind of landscape. So what we have to first do, I guess if I go back here, is we have to imagine that we flip the diagram. So here we're talking about basins of attraction, but when we go to the next slide, we imagine that we flipped those basins over, and so now there are peaks. And wherever these peaks are, they're considered to be stronger attractors, more robust or fitter attractors. It's just that we've inverted this landscape. And so there are two ways of talking about the same phenomena. One comes from physics, and we call these basins of attraction. The other comes from biology, and we call these fitness peaks. But they're really talking about the same concept. It's just that we flipped over the visualization in one system versus another. Okay, so in this system, we can imagine that if you are, a ball that's rolling, you're going to roll uphill as opposed to downhill in this situation. If we set you over here, that you will eventually sort of roll up towards this fitness peak. And then there may be a moment where where if you shook up the system, it could shake you into a different fitness peak, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those shakes might be the result of some kind of environmental disruption to the system. That means that whatever you were doing before is no longer fit within this particular new regime. So the fitness landscape is used as a kind of a metaphoric way of talking about the structure of fitness, or where are you within this landscape where you need to expend the minimum energy in order to maintain fitness or reproduction or health in some way. The fittest regimes in this illustration are the highest peak. So it's called climbing a peak is analogous to getting to be more fit. However, there are possibilities of becoming trapped on a lower peak, because once you enter into a peak, when you're at the top of this peak, in order to get to the top of this peak, you first have to come down, and it becomes, you never want to become less fit. So you have to think about, how do I get to a higher peak that's even more fit, rather than becoming trapped within a fitness peak? So an example of this idea of trapping is, I can illustrate with the keyboard that we're all using. The keyboard is known as the QWERTY keyboard, and that's because the letters on the top row on the left-hand side spell out QWERTY. The QWERTY keyboard was invented not because it was the most efficient keyboard for typing, but because when typewriters were invented, they were mechanical. And if the typist typed too quickly letters in sequence, the prongs that went up would jam with one another. And so in order to stop this jamming from happening, they wanted to slow down the typing of certain keys in sequence, and they created the board called the QWERTY keyboard that minimized this jamming. So it was very fit for a particular kind of mechanical typewriter. Now, if we go to our electronic keyboards, nothing's going to jam if we type faster, and we would like to type faster. That would be a more fit way of typing. But in order to get to that faster way of typing, we would first have to abandon, say QWERTY is over here and some other notional perfect keyboard is over here. I'm sure someone has invented this, I just don't know the name of it. In order to get there, and maybe it's not as far apart as we have on this, although there could be other sort of regimes of typing that take us along that trajectory, we would first have to become a slower typist. We would have to start learning anew how to type in a keyboard. And so there would be a period of time as we're abandoning this fitness peak where we become less fit, a slower typer, before we're eventually able to climb up this peak and become a much faster typer. And it is those kinds of dynamics that can keep you trapped within a fitness peak, where you're actually requiring more energy to do your typing. There's a better way, there's a smoother way, but we have a difficulty in reaching it. So there are two different ways in which you can think about achieving fitness. If I'm stationed over here, right, I can say, all right, I feel like I'm moving my way up, I'm developing expertise in something, and I'm going to continue this trajectory upwards. That's one way of achieving fitness, is you choose a peak and you stick with it and you move up that peak and you become sort of a real specialist in a particular area. The other way to think about it is you think, well, I'm over here, and maybe it's good, but maybe there's something better that I can be exploring. And then you may want to sort of jump and leap somewhere else within this fitness landscape. And as you're leaping around, there's no guarantee that you're going to wind up on a higher peak. For example, you can take a random jump, and instead of winding up here, you could wind up over here, which then you begin to climb this peak, and it actually is a lower peak than the one you were on before. So there's this trade-off between exploration of the fitness landscape and exploitation of a particular peak that you find yourself on. And there's actually different kinds of strategies that people have talked about of when should you be exploiting and when should you be exploring. Sometimes they say that earlier in life, when you have more time ahead of you, you should spend more time exploring your options. And later in life, when you have less time ahead of you, you want to kind of minimize risk. And so then you should spend more time exploiting where you're at rather than exploring all kinds of things at random. The other thing that's interesting about this metaphorical notion of fitness landscape is that the landscape itself can move, can change over time. So for example, a peak that you were on that maybe was fit at a given moment, say you're in the oil industry, and this is a very good way of earning money. That is a sort of particular fitness peak that you're inhabiting and you're doing really, really well. Maybe we can say that the oil producers are over here on this fitness peak and they've been exploiting it, so they're right at the top of their game. But the world is changing. People are becoming more conscious of environmental issues. People are more concerned about global warming, and also the costs of other renewables has been coming down. As a result, it may be that this peak, that is peak oil, begins to sort of shrink down, and you can be a company that's staying on this peak. But there's another peak over here that's maybe solar energy or other renewables. And this peak may actually be getting higher and higher and more fit. So there's a moment when you could be abandoning a peak that at one point was the tallest peak and moving to a different one. But again, this is all kind of a metaphorical way of talking about complexity, but we'll see that the metaphor can also have some actual physical dynamics to it. All right, so I told you that the idea of a basin of attraction is exactly the inverse of the idea of a fitness peak. So here's basically the same sort of illustration. We can think about this peak over here being analogous to this basin of attraction, and this peak over here being analogous to this basin of attraction. And again, we can see that this basin is actually a deeper basin and a larger basin, so that if you're starting on a trajectory and you're sort of exploring what is available to you, if you keep becoming fitter and fitter, you're going to sort of move into this particular area of the fitness landscape. And I hope that everyone can sort of see how this is analogous to this situation over here, that you've got a basin and a basin, you can be sitting over here. If you're within this basin, you are kind of attracted to this particular point. If you start off somewhere in this field, you are attracted to this point. So this is what we describe as being a basin of attraction, that if you start off somewhere within this basin, your tendency is going to keep on being within this basin, because every time you try to move away from it and out of it, you're actually expending energy to move out. Whereas if you continue following a trajectory in here, your fitness is improving, and you're minimizing your energy as you move down into that basin. It would be like that, a marble in one of those vortexes trying to move upwards instead of downwards. It's going against the normal flow. So those situations where you go against the normal flow would be more irrational, or would be very exceptional situations where something unusual is happening within the basin of attraction. Okay, so let's see how sand can explain to us better this idea of the notion of the basin of attraction. And I love this illustration because it really sort of visualizes this and takes it out of the metaphorical diagram and puts it into a physical reality. Imagine that we have a sandbox and we puncture a variety of holes in the sandbox at different spacings. The sand, depending on where it is relative to a hole, will begin to flow down and funnel through. And if you are a grain of sand and you're located somewhere within this zone of the flat sandbox, you are part of the basin of attraction of this hole by virtue of the fact that a sand grain is closer to this hole than to any of the other nearby holes. At this point, a grain of sand could move to either this hole or to this hole, right? Similarly, at this threshold over here. These are these threshold moments, and they're occurring at the midpoints between those two holes where you could equally go to either of the basins of attraction. But here we have sand figuring out this fitness landscape to sort of show us what are the larger basins, what are very small basins of attraction. You see, this basin doesn't get very this basin doesn't collect a lot of sand within it, whereas some of them are hollows that really grab a lot of sand from the surroundings. So anything within their field are drawn to it. It's a zone, it can be talked about as a zone of capture or tendency within a system's phase space. So if we have the space of all possibilities of how a system can unfold, we talked about that as a phase space. And the question is, what's an attractor within that phase space? Some systems have only one attractor. We talked about the pendulum. It's going to follow to that one attractor, which is hanging downward. But if we have a phase space where there's a multiplicity of attractors, and if it's not oscillating between attractors, it might also be drawn into a zone of attraction. And within a particular zone, regardless of where you start, you are drawn into that particular regime of performance. So how does a complex system find attractor states amongst its differential possibilities? Stuart Kaufman talked about this and compared exploring fit states as a random walk through a fitness landscape where it's following these, again, we're back to algorithms, where it's following rules. So, and this is a little bit technical. So again, I'm going to go through it. If you don't fully follow it, you can watch it again, or you can ignore it if you want to. But I think it's sort of interesting just talking about how randomness generates fitness. So we have a system that has 3 variables, and these 3 variables are represented in this column over here of zeros and ones, right? And they could be anything. They could be sound or color or depth or height or something. It doesn't really matter. 3 variables. And then there's some kind of evaluation of fitness, a kind of an indicator, and this comes back to cybernetics. Am I getting closer to a target, or am I getting further away from a target, right? And so there are sort of the notion that maybe you don't know what the optimum target is, you just know, am I getting closer to something better or farther away from fitness? And that might be represented as, am I reproducing more, or am my offspring are surviving, right? Okay, so if a change in any direction yields a higher fitness, then if you're doing this random walk and you sort of say, well, I can stay, or I could go in one of 3 directions, and I'll show you what I mean by one of 3 directions. So these digits here are represented on a cube. Okay, and this cube is sort of the phase space of all possible permutations of these numbers, represented as there only being this many permutations. Okay, so we have 3 digits, and we have 8 permutations of where you can be within this cube, and each of them is assigned randomly. Each of them is assigned being more fit or less fit than another state. So it just so happens that the combination of 1, 1, 1, and this is totally randomly assigned. We're just randomly assigned that happens to be the most fit area. So we can assign these numbers of fitness as being, oh, interesting. Sorry, I illustrated these backwards. 0.83 should be oh, that's unfortunate. This is the local peak. This is the trap, and this is the peak. I should change the slide right here. I wonder if I can do that. I wonder if I can do that. That would be sort of annoying to have this wrong. This is the global peak, and this is the local trap. Let's get your illustrations right. So my numbers align. This isn't taking too long. Everyone's happy watching me do this. Okay, 7, now we're back. And let's go to slideshow, play from current slide. Yes, all right, better. All right, I'll have to align this a bit better. But okay, we have it. So you're on this cube. These numbers have been randomly assigned. This one, 70 fitness, is pretty good, but it's compared to the others, but it's not as good as this 8-3. 8-3 is the best possible combination, and that's the combination of where you assign the first digit as a 1, the second as a 0, and the third as a 0. Those are your random variables that are changing. The random variables could be on or off, whatever. Okay, and so imagine that you are situated over here at 101. You look around you and you sort of say, gee, if I move in any direction, if I change any of these numbers, my fitness is going to go up. So you do. You change one number because you sort of say, if a change in any direction yields a higher fitness, move. You don't know what that higher fitness is going to be. You just know that changing a number moves my fitness up. All right, I go over here. and now I'm at 0, 0, 1. Now you say, well, does a change in fitness, does a change of any of these numbers make my fitness go up here? If I go this way, my fitness goes from 5 to 4, 7. If I go, I don't want to go backwards, but if I go this way, it goes from 5, 0 to 5, 2. So I'm going to move in the next iteration. And then can I move? Well, I can't go back again. If I go this way, I'm going to 4, 3, it goes down. I don't want to go backwards, but if I move this way, it goes to 70. So I'm going to go over here. All right, so I'm doing a random walk on this fitness landscape, which is represented by a three-dimensional cube. And I stay if a move in any direction is going to make, if a change in any of these variables is going to mean that my fitness goes down. So if I'm typing on a keyboard and changing a variable, changing to a different keyboard makes me type slower, I'm going to stay there. But the unfortunate thing is that this is a trap, because if I were to have randomly have moved, instead of going this way, if I moved this way towards higher fitness, and I don't know, I don't really know which way I'm going. Like I know, okay, I can move uphill in any of these three directions. All I know is that right now I'm downhill and I want to move uphill. So I'm going to move uphill in any three directions, but I don't know when I'm moving uphill, am I moving to the highest peak or am I just moving to a peak that's a little bit higher? So this idea of moving from this spot, I have limited knowledge of which direction of movement helps me. Over here, I know that, okay, if I'm moving either of these two directions, I'm moving downhill, and that's bad. I want to move uphill. So I know that I only have a choice of one direction, okay? But if when I was moving uphill, I'd happened to choose going in this direction, I would have wound up at a peak. And this one is 83, it's higher than here. This is actually the global peak within the system indicated in red. So column 1 is these interacting variables. Column 3 is the overall fitness of the permutation. And then we keep moving through these permutations until we get to what we consider to be, we hope, is the global peak. Now, I can stay here for a long time, and at some point I might just say, you know what, I'm just going to throw a random roll of the dice, basically, and try to get somewhere else, because maybe where I'm at, it's great, but it's not as great as it could be. And that would be the only way in which you could fully explore these fit states. But otherwise, you can get trapped. So yeah, so what did I want to say in this slide? I mean, basically, I think I've covered most of this. Change one of 3 variables in each round if the change yields a higher fitness move. What do we mean by variables? What do we mean by fitness? Can I make this a little bit more concrete for you? I talked about the QWERTY keyboard, but let's talk about something that ties it back to design. Okay, so I just want you to take a moment and think about a bed that can change states to become more fit. What does that mean? What constitutes fitness for a bed? How would you define that a bed is fit? Think about it for a second. So hopefully you're thinking that a bed is fit. Well, I mean, we could think about it a few ways. Well, it sells really well. Okay, yeah, that would be a measure of fitness. But maybe it's just sales hype, and it's not actually that the bed is doing what a bed is supposed to do. What makes a good bed? I would hope that a good bed, and we're talking about the mattress right now, not about the frame. Like, let's focus on the mattress itself. We would hope that a bed would be considered fit if the people sleeping on it had a good night's sleep. Okay, so that would, every time we're looking at a complex system, we have to think what for that particular system might represent fitness. And for this exercise, let's assume that fitness constitutes a good night's sleep. So then if we go back to our diagram over here, we can think, well, let's change these into minutes. This represents 83 minutes of sleep, 70 minutes of sleep, 50 minutes of sleep. So I lie down for a 3-hour nap, and all things being equal, that I could replicate the exact conditions of this nap 8 different times, right? Then I would have different qualities of sleep. And let's assume for the moment that this has nothing to do with my state of mind at the time that I'm sleeping, but really has to do with the characteristics of the bed itself. Okay, what kind of variables might a bed mutate to become more fit? So think about different preferences in sleeping and what those variables might be. When I've talked about this before in class, people have come up with a number of different variables. And if you're thinking about it, you may think, okay, well, what about firmness? Firmness might be a variable. We can think about these sort of slider bars and parameters where firmness is one variable. Think about what a couple of other variables might be. I'll give you a second. Okay, so we imagine a bed of 3 variables, W1, W2, W3. And we start off with these variables at different positions on this kind of slider bar. So W1 is at 6, W2 is at 3, and W3 is at 5. My graph isn't perfect here, but notionally, let's say. And that yields an overall fitness of when I go to sleep, that I sleep for 47 minutes. And I can decide, am I happy with that or unhappy with that? And then the bed can sort of say, all right, what is it going to change? How is it going to mutate? And then it's going to record, did that mutation, did sliding one of these bars mean that a sensor picked up that I was sleeping more, or that the sensor picked up that I was sleeping less? So the bed needs to have some way of tuning feedback. It is now that oarsman, and it's saying, do I need to steer more to the left or more to the right? And the input that it's receiving is how much sleep it records me as getting. Or like a thermostat, it's recording, am I moving, am I getting colder than the desired temperature? Or am I getting warmer than the desired temperature, right? What do I need to do to adjust if my goal is to kind of create the optimum sleep? So here's some variables that we can talk about. So say W1 is the mattress, firmness to softness, and W2 is the mattress, coolness to warmth. And W3, sometimes people have said, well, it could be, is there ambient sound in the room or not? Some people like it totally quiet. Some people like ambient sound. In this case, I just threw in a pillow. I know that I said, think about the mattress, but forgive me. Pillow, thickness to thinness. So imagine that maybe the bed angles up a little bit and gives you a bit more head support or not. Okay, so if the bed, now we think of the bed now as being the agent in the system that is trying to become more fit. The bed is trying to say, I want to be the best bed ever for me, Sharon, your professor, your user. Your bed may have a different, may need to adjust differently to its particular ecosystem because the fitness landscape that it's working in has different needs. I might like a really firm mattress, and you might like a really soft mattress. And so the bed can sort of say, within the context that I'm operating within, what does being fit mean for me within this particular niche context? So if adjusting any variable results in it monitoring that its user has gotten a better sleep, then change that variable, right? If the change results in less sleep, stay put, right? So it can start to permutate these variables, and it then does the same thing as walking around in this fitness landscape, trying to sort of say, well, it's it's changing parameter 0 to 1, so it's changing, what did we say, that was the firmness, going from firm to soft. Let's try that and see what happens, right? And then it may be sort of trying these different sort of scenarios out at random. And there's a possibility that it could fall on a scenario where changing any parameter results in the sleep becoming worse, where now it's trapped in that regime, that there is a better ratio of these sort of parameters that would give me a better sleep, but it becomes trapped. So occasionally it may want to try jumping away and rebooting the system and trying it a second time. And then if it tries it a second time and it consistently winds up in the same sort of order arrangement, then it knows, okay, that's probably the most fit behavior as a bed. But if it tries it a variety of times and finds that, oh, it can set the parameters a different way, or the system can gradually gravitate to a scenario where I sleep longer, then it's found that global peak. Okay. Hopefully you understand this. Again, it's a bit more technical. I think people get scared away by all of this sort of diagramming stuff that I have here, but you can go through it again. And the main things to keep in mind is the idea that there are variables that can mutate, and the mutations help you understand where you are within the fitness landscape. And that these mutations can sort of also be thought about as a three-dimensional sort of landscape that you're moving through, where you're sort of changing parameters as you're going along this grid, trying to figure out what combination of parameters is giving you the most functionality within a system. Okay. And this, I guess, I just wanted to reiterate this piece about moving from between basins, and how I talked about the word perturbations, that sometimes you require a shock within the system in order for you to move from one system to another. So if I'm stuck over here where my perception is that, oh, I'm less fit if I go this way and I'm less fit if I go this way, and I don't really understand that there's a bigger basin where I'm much, much more fit if I'm over here, I need to get to that saddle point, then I like to think of it as almost like you just shake the system and you give it a hard shake. And then things that are a little bit away from being in a better basin, if you have that shaking up, that it's going to move to that point. And this is going to kind of fall into play when we think a little bit about what's been happening with COVID-19. And I would say there's a lot of disturbances that are occurring because of this outbreak. But some of what's occurring is that things that were actually already operating in a suboptimum way, this is a major shakeup. And those businesses are really now having to rethink their models and move into a different regime of performing, because the regime that they're stuck in is sort of like a historical residue of back when maybe the basin that they were in was a much deeper basin. But now the dynamics around them, the technology around them, people's expectations around them have changed. So the fitness landscape has altered, and there's much, much better basins of attraction that they could be in, but they're not. So we're going to talk about that for part of the remainder of the class. Okay. I just want to talk a little bit about the logistic map, and I'll have to think about how I tie this into ideas about fitness. The logistic map is, I want to call it the most beautiful map you've never heard of. I am actually kind of obsessed with this map because it's a map that I first saw about 20 years ago, and it keeps revealing its beauty and its mysteries to me. And the more I learn about it, the more awestruck I am by how powerful this diagram is. Like I was saying to my husband, if you get excited about pi, like you think pi is a cool number, pi is nothing. Like until you've really understood the logistic map, forget it. The logistic map is depicting a system that cycles between different kinds of attractors. And if we're over here in the system, attractors stay relatively steady throughout the system. And then we get to a point where the system splits. But that split isn't like a branching where it goes down one path or another path. That path means that now it's oscillating between two different states. So you go through one iteration, it's here, the next iteration, it's there. One iteration here, next iteration there. It's jumping between states, which is different from here. Here it's moving, but the state is altering slightly. It's going up to where it is in the system space, but it's staying smooth. It's following a smooth trajectory. Here it starts to jump. When we get to this point, which is the next bifurcation, but again, it's not a splitting of pathways, but we get to this moment in the system, it now starts moving between 4 different states. So I just let's go back to that for a second and talk about it in terms of examples that you've seen in class. So when you have the pendulum that's swinging, it's in this kind of more steady state mode, right? Like it's swinging back and forth. Maybe it's getting, I guess, as it's going, it gradually gets sort of faster, right? Because it's oscillating back and forth, and then it gradually slows down. No, it does slow down, doesn't it? Think about that. How do I describe that better? I guess what I want to say here is really that it's sort of, its goal is this kind of steady state at the bottom, and that it keeps passing through one point, right? But the rate at which it's passing through that one point, which is the base, which is its attractor, is changing over time. And that's that slight change over time over here as it slows down. But imagine that it's a pendulum that's sort of speeding up. Then we get to this point, and you know what? I'm not going to start this video over again because I'm pretty far in, and I don't want to chop it and edit it. But I'm going to go back a step and tell you about the logistic map, not in terms of a pendulum, but in terms of a chemical oscillator. But, or sorry, in terms of predator-prey model. But what I want to say is this would be the behavior of a pendulum. This would be the behavior of a chemical oscillator when I talked about a system that moves between two different states. Okay, that's the first point. Now let's look at it as a system, not two different systems. This is really just talking about when you have a single attractor, when you have two attractors would be the chemical oscillator. Now let's think about the predator-prey model. If you have a bunch of rabbits reproducing, the rabbits are in an environment that has a carrying capacity of their eating grass, and they're able to reproduce, and they're reproducing just fine. There's still a limited amount of grass, but really the limitation of that grass hasn't really kicked in yet, you know? The rabbits' reproduction rate, they're not that so many of them that kind of force of the grass, you know, getting more scarce is really having an impact on them. But there's going to be a moment in the system where the fact that, yeah, they are living in an environment where there isn't that much grass and they keep on being more and more and more and more and more bunnies, that more and more and more bunnies is this line sort of going up with every generation. We get to a moment where it's like, okay, you know what? Somehow we've kicked into an extra regime where we're beyond the carrying capacity, where the rabbits have gotten to the point that there's a boom in the population, but then there's a crash the next year because there's not enough grass. And then it kind of goes back and forth because every time there's a crash, the grass has an opportunity to recover. So the next generation, there is enough food, but then you get a crash again, and then you get this sort of rate going up, and it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, oscillating between population levels. And then you get to another moment again, and what we're doing here is we're ramping up the reproduction rate. We're imagining that these bunnies, they just keep on reproducing every generation, and we keep on increasing the reproduction rate. When you increase the reproduction rate beyond this point, now it starts crashing and booming and crashing and booming and crashing. But instead of it doing in a regular cycle, just back and forth, now it goes through a cycle of 4. It's called period 4. And then it goes in the next iteration to period 6, and then period 8. And then it just keeps crashing around all over the place, right? And we talk about it going into its chaotic regime. So I just want to, like, when we blow into this drawing and zoom in, this is like these points of population, and they're going up and down and up and down and up and down. And then when we get over here, there's like 4 points that it's moving between. It's an oscillation. So this is an illustration of the dynamics of certain systems that oscillate between different attractors. And I hope you sort of understand the general principles of what we're talking about here, and then we'll get into why this diagram is so amazing and beautiful, because right now you're just thinking, why are you going on about this? Okay, I get it. Some things oscillate versus stay stable. Sort of understand the principle, but what's so interesting about this drawing? Okay, so the dynamics of the drawing that I want to tell you about is that in the drawing, there's always a driving force that's being amplified. And that driving force, we're talking about it as, okay, the pressure of reproductive rates. Also, within the system, there is something that is acting to suppress the system simultaneously. And that suppression is kicking in with a kind of a lag time in relation to, say, the reproduction rate. So here, the inherent resistance would be the carrying capacity of the land. And so you have a system that's kind of got 2 variables, but the variables are actually in a feedback loop. They're in a kind of cybernetic feedback loop because the grass can't grow back very quickly when the population of rabbits explodes. And that means that the next generation is going to start to die off, right? And then it's finally the grass is going to pick up, and then the rabbits are going to start to repopulate. But they're not going to be in a perfect, even back and forth, you know, where every year, okay, well, you know, we tweak it here and it goes back to this and back to this and back to this. That might happen for a little while, but you can imagine that it doesn't happen at a perfectly even rate, right? That the rates will start to change. And then here's where it becomes this, I hope will just blow your mind. I hope it blows your mind. In these systems where you have this push, and I could call it this force, right? And when I say force, I mean this driving force, and inherent resistance, and we can think about this inherent resistance as being drag or suppression. Regardless of the system that we're talking about, the bifurcation diagram will illustrate the dynamics. So we talked about it in terms of reproduction. We can also talk about it in terms of the rhythm of a dripping faucet. So imagine that we have a dripping faucet. We have a couple of things going on. One is the resistance of water that wants to sort of form a water bubble. The other is the pressure of the tap that is sort of wanting to push that water out. Imagine a tap dripping, what it sounds like. We have drip, 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 right? That's regular. But if there is too much, as the forces increase, the water pressure is increased, it'll start to change. It'll sound like drip, 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 right? And so now we have a different kind of dynamic, and that drip, 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 drip pattern, that's like this sort of going back and forth, right? Drip, 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 drip. As we increase the water pressure, it starts to enter into a period 4. Drip, 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 drip. I could go on. My husband said, please don't do this, Sharon. Don't make all the sounds of the dripping tap, especially not when it goes into the chaotic regime. The patterns of the dripping are exactly the same when you map them as the patterns when you model the reproductive strategies with a carrying capacity. And this is not just in these two systems randomly. This is in all kinds of systems. It's everywhere. It is in airflow currents that are encountering sort of force and resistance. It's in heart rhythms. It's everywhere. We are finding that bifurcation diagram all over the place. And we find it in the Mandelbrot set. So here we go. There it is. When we turn the Mandelbrot set on the side, when we're looking at the Mandelbrot set, often you're seeing it as a diagram that's shown in 2 dimensions. But when we actually look at what that system is doing in terms of where those numbers that form the Mandelbrot fractal would be plotted 3-dimensionally, we see that if we take a slice through it in section, we have the bifurcation diagram. That should blow your mind. The other place that we have it is we have it in strange attractors. So if you've heard of Lorenz's strange attractors, and I can post a little video that illustrates this, we find it in strange attractors too. So it is everywhere. The mathematics of it are beautiful. The other thing that's incredible within this is these moments where you sort of see this gap forming over here. You're in this chaotic regime where there seems to be no pattern in terms of the rhythm of the oscillations. And then you get these pauses where it goes back to being a very simple drip, 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 drip. So you're in this kind of super chaotic motion of these drips, and then suddenly it calms back down again before going back into this chaotic regime. And then there's all sorts of numerical constants similar to pi in terms of the ratios, and the structure is self-similar too. So I could go on about this, but it's a key feature of complex systems that a lot of complex systems will wind up having the characteristics of this particular diagram. And then just a couple of closing comments about it. As a key system input is increased, right, more attractor states become possible. So if the input is reproduction rates for rabbits, then as the reproduction rate is increased, then we have more attractor states. So you could either have a large population or a small population. It's gonna oscillate. It's gonna move between these 2 bases of attraction. At each generation, the system will cycle amongst multiple attractors as it's moving through. So here you can see we don't just have 2; we have almost an infinite number. This over here is called the chaotic regime. So some input systems will have an infinite number of states that can be cycled through that are never repeating, and this is chaos. And when we go and when we go into the Mandelbrot set, we can see that it keeps on continuing forever. You all saw that video where we just kept going in deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the Mandelbrot set. And this is this idea that the system is never repeating, but we get some moments of sort of where it almost is returning to that original set. So when we're over here, right, and cycling, it's that mini Mandelbrot that we saw when we were zooming in at different scales. And that's going to keep on repeating through the system. So the longer we follow it, we're going to find these other kind of tiny little regimes where it becomes, again, more orderly within the system. Okay. Thanks very much.